The sun was setting over Lancaster County, painting the sky in hues of amber and gold when Morgan Freeman's black Mercedes took that fateful wrong turn down a dusty Pennsylvania road. The acclaimed actor, known for his roles as God and his voice, of wisdom found himself face to face with a different kind of divinity, the simple, profound truth of Amish life. As his car rolled to a stop near a weathered barn, Freeman watched an elderly man guiding a young girl's hands as she learned to milk a cow. Something in that moment, perhaps the peaceful expression on their faces or the timeless nature of the scene, stirred something deep within him. What happened next would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, wisdom, and life's true meaning. What could an 85-year-old Amish elder teach one of Hollywood's most respected actors about life's greatest lessons? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Lancaster counties, patchwork fields as Morgan Freeman's GPS insisted he'd reached his destination. He hadn't, of course, at least not the one he'd intended. The sophisticated navigation system in his Mercedes had led him far from the scheduled interview in Philadelphia, deep into the heart of Amish country. But perhaps, as he would later reflect, he had arrived exactly where he needed to be. Morgan shifted in his leather seat, his weathered hands relaxing their grip on the steering wheel. At 85, he'd grown accustomed to life's unexpected detours, learning to find wisdom in wrong turns. Through the windshield, he watched as horse-drawn buggies clip-clopped past, their occupants offering polite nods without a hint of recognition. Here, his Academy Award meant nothing. His face, so familiar to millions, was just another stranger's visage in their unhurried world. He reached for his phone to call his assistant, then paused. Something about this moment felt significant, like the opening scene of a story he was meant to experience. The late summer air, heavy with the scent of fresh-cut hay and distant rain, drifted through his partially opened window. In the adjacent field, a group of children played a simple game of baseball, their bare feet kicking up dust as they ran between bases marked by worn feed sacks. When was the last time I saw kids playing without phones in their hands? He mused aloud, his distinctive voice filling the car's quiet interior. The thought transported him back to his own childhood in Mississippi, where entertainment meant imagination and physical play, not screens and digital distractions. A gentle knock on his window startled him from his reverie. An elderly Amish man stood beside the car, his silver beard catching the golden light. Behind him, a teenage girl in a traditional dress and bonnet watched with curious eyes. "Friend," the man said as Morgan lowered his window. "Thee seems lost. Can we offer assistance?" Morgan smiled, the familiar crinkles deepening around his eyes. "I believe I am, though I'm beginning to think it might be a fortunate mistake." He extended his hand through the window. "I'm Morgan Freeman." The elder's weathered hand met his in a firm grip. "I am Joseph Miller. This is my granddaughter, Sarah." He gestured to the girl, who offered a shy smile. "We were about to begin the evening milking. Perhaps thee would like to rest a while before finding thy way back to the English world." There was something in Joseph's invitation that transcended mere courtesy, a genuine warmth that reminded Morgan of his grandfather, a man who believed that strangers were just friends waiting to be made. The actor found himself nodding before he'd fully processed the decision. "I'd like that very much," he replied, switching off the engine. As he stepped out of the car, his knees protesting slightly, Sarah's eyes widened with recognition. "Grandfather," she whispered, tugging at Joseph's sleeve. "He's the man from the moving pictures some of the English children speak of." Joseph studied Morgan's face with new understanding but maintained his serene demeanor. "Fame is but a shadow, Sarah. Here we shall know him as a friend in need of rest." The wisdom in those simple words struck Morgan deeply. Throughout his career, he'd played roles that dispensed profound truths: God, presidents, mentors. But here was authenticity that no script could capture. They walked together toward a whitewashed barn, its doors standing open to welcome the evening breeze. Inside, the air was cool and sweet with hay. Rows of Holstein cows stood in their stalls, their large eyes following the newcomer with mild interest. The scene was so far removed from Hollywood's glitter that it felt like stepping into another century. "Sarah," Joseph called, "show our friend where he might hang his coat." The girl guided Morgan to a row of simple wooden pegs where he carefully placed his expensive jacket next to well-worn work clothes. As Morgan watched, Joseph and Sarah began their evening routine with practiced efficiency. There was a rhythm to their movements, a choreography more authentic than any he'd seen on film. The gentle sounds of milk hitting metal pails created a peaceful percussion that echoed through the barn. "Would thee like to learn?" Joseph asked, noticing Morgan's interest. "There is something profound in connecting with God's creatures through honest work." Morgan hesitated, looking down at his casual but clearly expensive clothes. "I wouldn't want to make a mess of things," Sarah spoke up, her initial shyness fading. "Everyone must learn sometime. I could show you how we do it by hand, though most English farms use machines now." "By hand?" Morgan's eyebrows rose. "I've never milked a cow in my life, let alone by hand. And at my age—" He chuckled, but Joseph's response silenced him. "Age is no barrier to learning, friend. I am 85 myself, and each day brings new lessons if we are humble enough to receive them." The synchronicity of their ages wasn't lost on Morgan. Here was a man who had lived as long as he had, yet their lives couldn't have been more different. While Morgan had traveled the world, Joseph had found his universe in these few acres. While Morgan had played countless roles, Joseph had lived one life with unwavering authenticity. "Well then," Morgan said, rolling up his sleeves, "I suppose it's never too late to learn something new." Sarah brought him a low wooden stool and positioned it beside a gentle-eyed cow named Daisy. With patient words and careful demonstrations, she showed him how to position his hands, how to establish a rhythm that would keep the cow comfortable and cooperative. Morgan's first attempts were clumsy, earning him a few disapproving looks from Daisy. But gradually, under Sarah's guidance and Joseph's quiet observation, he began to find the right touch. The first stream of warm milk hitting the pail brought a smile to his face that had nothing to do with acting. "There's a satisfaction in this," he observed. "That's hard to explain." Joseph nodded, settling onto his own stool beside him. "It is the satisfaction of doing something real, something necessary. In your world, friend, how often do you create things that exist only as light on a screen?" The question wasn't accusatory, but contemplative, and it struck Morgan deeply. "Most of my life's work exists that way," he admitted. "We tell stories, try to capture truth through fiction, but this—" He gestured to the barn around them, to the warm animal beside him, to the actual results of his labor in the pail. "This is different." As they worked, Joseph began to share stories of his life on the farm. He spoke of his father teaching him these same skills, of watching his children and grandchildren learn them in turn. He talked about the changes he'd seen in the world beyond their community, changes they chose to meet with careful consideration rather than automatic rejection. "We are not frozen in time, as some think," Joseph explained. "We simply ask of each new thing, will this bring us closer to God and to each other, or will it push us apart?" Morgan found himself sharing stories, too, of his childhood in Mississippi, of the mentors who had guided him, of the long journey to finding his voice in the world. As they talked, Sarah moved between them, absorbing their words while attending to her tasks with quiet efficiency. The conversation flowed as naturally as the milk into their pails, touching on subjects both profound and mundane. They spoke of family, of faith, of the changing world beyond the farm's boundaries. Joseph listened with the same attention he gave to everything, offering observations that revealed a mind far more engaged with the modern world than Morgan had expected. "Your people choose simplicity," Morgan noted, "but there's nothing simple about your understanding of life." Joseph smiled, the expression barely visible beneath his beard. "Simplicity in living frees the mind for deeper thought. We choose fewer distractions not because we fear them, but because we value attention." As the evening progressed, more family members arrived for the milking. Joseph's wife Hannah, her gray hair neat beneath her bonnet, brought out cups of fresh water and homemade cookies. Their son David, initially reserved around the famous visitor, gradually joined the conversation, sharing his own perspectives on balancing tradition with necessity. Morgan observed the family's interactions with professional interest. Here was a dynamic he'd never seen portrayed accurately on screen. The subtle strength of their relationships, the unspoken understanding that flowed between generations. There was no patriarch ruling with an iron fist, as movies often depicted, but rather a web of mutual respect and shared purpose. Hannah, seeing Morgan's thoughtful expression, settled onto a nearby hay bale. "Thee seem surprised by something," she observed. "I'm surprised by many things," Morgan admitted, "but mostly by how much I misunderstood about your way of life. We make movies about the Amish sometimes, but we never quite capture this." Gestured vaguely, searching for the right word. "Peace," Hannah suggested. "That's part of it, but also the complexity. We tend to show either perfect simplicity or hidden darkness. The truth is far more interesting." Hannah's laugh was warm and knowing. "Life is always more interesting than stories, isn't it? Even for one who tells stories for a living." As the last cow was milked and the equipment cleaned, Morgan found himself reluctant to leave. The evening had taken on a dreamlike quality, yet it felt more real than many of his recent experiences. He helped Sarah carry the last of the milk to the cooling room, watching as she expertly transferred it into large storage containers. "You'll come back tomorrow?" she asked suddenly, then blushed at her own forwardness. Before Morgan could respond, Joseph appeared in the doorway. "Sarah speaks hastily," he said, "but perhaps she speaks truly. Would thee consider returning? There is more to learn if thee wishes." Morgan looked between them, the elderly man whose wisdom had captivated him and the young girl whose openness had touched him. In their faces he saw an invitation to something precious and rare, authentic connection in an increasingly artificial world. "I had planned to return to Los Angeles tomorrow," he said slowly. "But plans can change. Sometimes they should change." Joseph nodded, understanding more than was said. "Then we will expect thee tomorrow. Perhaps we can show thee more of our world, and thee can tell us more of thine." As Morgan drove back to his hotel that evening, guided by Joseph's precise directions rather than his GPS, he found himself reflecting on the unexpected turn his day had taken. He'd played wise men in countless films, delivered lines crafted to sound profound. But there in that barn, listening to Joseph's simple observations and Sarah's earnest questions, he'd encountered a wisdom that no scriptwriter could capture. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant. "Cancel my flight." "Tomorrow," he said, "and the next day too. Something more important has come up." He paused, smiling at what he was about to say. "I'm going to learn how to milk cows." The assistant's confused response made him laugh, but he offered no further explanation. Some experiences, he was learning, needed to be lived rather than explained. As he settled into his hotel room, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. Outside his window, the stars shone brighter than they did in Los Angeles, unmarred by city lights. Somewhere out there, he knew the Miller family would be finishing their evening prayers, preparing for another day of purposeful work and quiet wisdom. He had come to Pennsylvania seeking a simple interview. Instead, he'd found himself at the beginning of what promised to be a far more meaningful story. Dawn broke over Lancaster County with the gentle persistence of tradition, painting the sky in watercolor strokes of pink and gold. Morgan Freeman arrived at the Miller farm just as the first rooster announced the day, his Mercedes looking strangely out of place beside the weathered fence posts. This time he'd dressed more appropriately, simple work clothes purchased from a local store, their tags still attached but their purpose clear. Joseph was already in the barnyard, his tall figure silhouetted against the morning light as he scattered feed for the chickens. He acknowledged Morgan's arrival with a slight nod, the kind that spoke volumes in its simplicity. "Thee has returned," he said, though it wasn't quite a question. "I have," Morgan replied, his rich voice carrying across the morning stillness. and I brought something more suitable for farm work." He gestured to his new attire. Joseph's eyes crinkled with amusement. "The clothes do not make the farmer, friend, but the heart might." He handed Morgan the feed bucket. "Shall we begin with breakfast? For the animals, that is. Our own comes after the morning work." As Morgan took the bucket, something shifted in the air between them. This wasn't a tourist's visit or a celebrity's whim anymore. It was an acceptance of invitation, a step into a different rhythm of life. The weight of the feed in his hands felt like a responsibility, small but significant. Sarah appeared from the barn, her face brightening at the sight of their visitor. "I told Mother you would come," she said, then quickly added, "if God willed it, of course." The morning unfolded in a series of simple but purposeful tasks. Morgan learned the proper way to check eggs for freshness, how to approach the horses without startling them, the importance of speaking softly around the nervous young calf born just last week. Each lesson came with its own wisdom, delivered, not through lecture but through quiet example. As they worked, other members of the community began to arrive. Word had spread, not of Morgan Freeman, the actor's presence, but of an English friend who had shown genuine interest in their way of life. Each arrival brought a new perspective, a different piece of the complex puzzle that was Amish life. Rebecca Yoder, a widow whose farm adjoined the Millers, brought fresh bread and concern about the changing weather. "The signs speak of early frost," she said, her eyes scanning the horizon. "The English weather services say otherwise, but my grandmother's wisdom hasn't failed yet." Morgan found himself drawn into conversations that wove between practical farming matters and deeper, philosophical questions. These people, he realized, lived in a constant state of thoughtful engagement with their world. Every decision, from when to plant to how to raise their children, was measured against generations of accumulated wisdom. The morning's relative peace was interrupted by the arrival of David Miller's oldest son, Benjamin, running from the western field with urgent news. A fox had gotten into the chicken coop at the far edge of the property, and the damage was severe. The community mobilized immediately, but it was what happened next that would change everything. As they hurried toward the western field, Joseph began to explain their approach to such crises. "We face troubles together," he said, his stride purposeful despite his age. "Each challenge is an opportunity to—" He stopped mid-sentence, his hand going to his chest. For a moment he seemed to lose his balance. Morgan reached out instinctively, catching the elder's arm. "Joseph?" The old man straightened, waving off concern with a gesture that seemed more habit than conviction. "It is nothing. The morning air, perhaps." But his face had gone pale beneath his beard, and his breathing had become labored. Sarah, who had been walking ahead with her mother, turned back at the sound of their voices. Her eyes widened as she took in her grandfather's condition. "Grandfather?" The worry in her voice carried across the morning air. Hannah rushed to her husband's side, her movements quick but controlled. There was no panic in her manner, but the concern in her eyes spoke volumes. "Joseph, this is the third time this week." Morgan looked sharply at them. "This has happened before?" "It will pass," Joseph insisted, but his voice lacked its usual strength. He tried to take a step forward and stumbled slightly. Morgan and David caught him from either side. The moment crystallized. Hollywood actor and Amish farmer supporting a man who had bridged their worlds through simple wisdom. The irony might have been amusing under different circumstances. "He needs medical attention," Morgan said firmly, his deep voice carrying the authority of decades of playing decisive characters. But this wasn't a movie, and the next decisions would have real consequences. Hannah's face showed the conflict they all understood. The Amish weren't opposed to modern medicine, but their approach to healthcare, like everything else, was measured and community-centered. The nearest hospital was in Lancaster, and the decision to seek English medical care was never taken lightly. "We have our healing ways," David began, but Sarah interrupted with uncharacteristic boldness. "The English doctors helped Sister Ruth when her heart was troubled," she said. "And grandfather is not well. Anyone can see it. Joseph had recovered. Enough to stand more steadily, but the episode had left its mark. His face was drawn and his breathing remained uneven. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we should practice what we teach about pride not standing in the way of wisdom." The decision, when it came, was both traditional and progressive. They would take Joseph to the hospital, but they would do it their way, with prayer, with family, and with consideration for their beliefs. Morgan's car, however, presented an unexpected solution to their immediate need for transportation. It would be faster than the buggy, Hannah admitted, looking at the Mercedes with a mixture of reluctance and practical consideration, and more comfortable, Morgan added gently. "I'm a careful driver." The next few minutes were a flurry of quiet but efficient activity. Hannah gathered Joseph's things while Sarah ran to inform the neighbors who had gathered for the fox hunt. David organized the remaining farm work, ensuring nothing would be neglected in their absence. As Morgan helped Joseph into the passenger seat, the old man caught his arm. "Strange," he said with a ghost of his usual smile. "How God brings help in unexpected forms." The drive to Lancaster General Hospital was a study in contrasts. Through the car's windows they passed horse-drawn buggies and modern tractors, Amish schoolhouses and contemporary gas stations. Joseph sat quietly, his eyes closed but his presence filling the car with dignified patience. Hannah and Sarah followed in a neighbor's van, a concession to urgency that would be discussed at length in the community later. Morgan found himself hyper-aware of every bump in the road, every turn that might disturb his passenger. He had driven these roads just yesterday, lost and frustrated. Now each mile had purpose. At the hospital, the worlds collided more dramatically. The sight of an Amish elder being helped through the emergency room doors by Morgan Freeman caused more than a few double takes. But the staff's professionalism quickly took over. Joseph was whisked away for examination, his family following, close behind. Morgan found himself in the waiting room, oddly reluctant to leave. He had played scenes in hospital waiting rooms dozens of times, but sitting there for real, watching Hannah's quiet prayers and Sarah's nervous fidgeting, was entirely different. No director would call cut to end this tension. Hours passed. The waiting room television, mounted high in one corner, played a movie Morgan had starred in years ago. No one watched it. Sarah spent the time teaching him to read in their prayer book, her finger moving carefully under the German text as she translated in whispers. When the doctor finally emerged, his expression was serious but not grave. "Mr. Miller has experienced several minor heart attacks," he explained. "We'd like to keep him for observation and possibly perform some additional tests. With proper treatment and some lifestyle changes, there's no reason he can't continue to live a full life." The phrase lifestyle changes hung in the air like a challenge. In the Amish world, where every aspect of life was interconnected with faith and community, changes were never simple. Hannah absorbed the news with quiet strength, asking practical questions about treatment options and recovery time. Sarah held her grandmother's hand, her young face showing the weight of understanding beyond her years. As they were finally allowed to visit Joseph in his room, Morgan held back, feeling suddenly like an intruder in this family moment. But Joseph's voice, weak but clear, called him in. "Our friend should hear what must be said," he insisted. The hospital room, with its modern equipment and fluorescent lighting, seemed to emphasize Joseph's otherworldliness. In his plain clothes, his beard neat despite the day's trials, he looked like a figure from another time. Yet his eyes were sharp as ever as he looked at each person in turn. "God has given us a warning," he said simply, "and with it, a choice. We must consider what changes wisdom requires." The word changes seemed to echo in the small room. Morgan, standing near the door, watched the family absorb its implications. In their world, change was never undertaken lightly, but neither was it rejected out of hand when necessity proved its worth. "The doctor speaks of rest," Hannah said softly, "of less work in the fields." "The community will help," Sarah added quickly. "Everyone will want to." Joseph nodded, but his expression suggested he was seeing beyond the immediate situation. "Perhaps," he said slowly, This is also a time for teaching rather than doing, for sharing wisdom rather than showing it. He turned his gaze to Morgan, and something passed between them, an understanding that transcended their different worlds. Yesterday, they asked about our ways, about how we choose what to keep and what to change. Perhaps God has given us an opportunity to explore these questions together. Morgan found himself nodding, drawn in by the elder's quiet authority even, from a hospital bed. "I'd like that," he said simply. "Then let us make an agreement," Joseph proposed. "Thee will learn our ways, not just the work of our hands, but the reasons behind our choices. And in return, perhaps thee can help us understand the world that sometimes pushes against our borders. We need not change our beliefs to understand why others believe differently." The proposal hung in the air like a challenge and an opportunity. Morgan looked around the room, at Hannah's quiet strength, at Sarah's hopeful face, at David's thoughtful consideration. He thought about his own schedule, about the commitments waiting in Los Angeles, about the scripts piling up on his agent's desk. Then he thought about the peace he'd felt in that barn yesterday morning, about the wisdom in Joseph's simple observations, about the way this family had welcomed him without regard for his fame. He thought about how many roles he'd played dispensing wisdom, and how rarely he'd had the chance to truly receive it. "I accept," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decision. "Though I suspect I'll learn far more than I can teach." Joseph's smile was tired but genuine. "That, friend, is the beginning of wisdom." As the evening settled over Lancaster County, Morgan found himself driving back to the farm with Hannah and Sarah, while David stayed with his father. The hospital room's television had been turned off at Joseph's request, but not before they'd all seen the first news reports about Morgan Freeman's mysterious disappearance from his scheduled appearances. "There will be questions," he admitted to Hannah, "about why I'm here, about your community." Hannah's response was characteristically measured. "Questions are not always bad things, friend. Sometimes they lead us to answers we didn't know we were seeking." As they pulled up to the farmhouse, the evening milking would still need to be done. Life's rhythms continued, even as life itself changed. Sarah disappeared into the barn to begin the work, while Hannah paused on the porch. "Will thee stay?" she asked simply. Morgan looked at the settling dusk, at the peaceful farm, at the life so different from his own. "Yes," he said. "I'll stay. I gave my word to Joseph." "Good." Hannah nodded. "Then we begin tomorrow. There is much to learn and much to understand." As Morgan drove back to his hotel that night, his phone filled with messages from his agent, his publicist, his studio contacts, he felt an unusual sense of peace. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, explanations to be made, arrangements to be changed, questions to be answered. But for now, he had made a promise to a wise man in a hospital bed, and that promise felt more real than any contract he'd signed in years. The stars were bright again over Lancaster County, and somewhere in the hospital, an Amish elder was probably sharing wisdom with his nurses. Morgan smiled at the thought. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important roles we play are the ones where we stop playing roles altogether. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after rain. Morgan pulled up to the Miller farm just as the first hints of sunrise were breaking through dissipating clouds. This time, he wasn't alone. His arrival had been noticed by the media, and a small cluster of news vans had gathered at the edge of the county road, held back by local police who understood the Amish desire for privacy. Sarah was waiting by the fence, her dark dress and white bonnet a stark contrast to the modern chaos trying to unfold beyond their boundaries. "The English world has found thee," she observed quietly as Morgan parked his car behind the barn, away from prying cameras. "They always do," he replied, his voice carrying a weight of experience. "But this isn't their story to tell." Hannah emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. "We've had calls from the bishop," she said without preamble, "and from other communities. They worry about the attention." There was no accusation in her voice, only a statement of fact. Morgan nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation he'd inadvertently created. "I can leave if my presence causes trouble for your community." "Trouble?" Hannah's eyes crinkled slightly. "Friend, trouble is what happens when we run from God's purpose. Joseph believes thy presence here has meaning. That is enough for us." She gestured toward the house. "Come. Breakfast first, then we talk." The kitchen was warm and filled with the scent of fresh bread and coffee, a concession to their English guest that Hannah had decided was within acceptable bounds. Around the large table sat several community elders who had arrived early, their faces serious, but not unwelcoming. "They wish to understand thy intentions," Hannah explained as she poured coffee into simple mugs, "and to share their thoughts on Joseph's proposal." For the next hour, Morgan found himself engaged in one of the most remarkable conversations of his career. These men, with their beards and plain clothes, spoke with careful consideration about the challenges facing their community in a rapidly changing world. They discussed the pressure of urban expansion, the lure of technology on their young people, and the delicate balance between maintaining their way of life and adapting to necessary changes. "Joseph speaks of thee as a bridge," said Elder Stoltzfus, his English precise despite his heavy accent. "A way to help others understand our choices without compromising our beliefs. But such bridges must be built carefully." Morgan set down his coffee mug, choosing his words with the same care they had shown. "In my work, I've often played roles that helped people understand different ways of life, but those were just stories. This," he gestured to encompass the kitchen, the farm, the community, "this is real, and it deserves to be understood, not just portrayed." Sarah, who had been quietly serving breakfast, spoke up. "Grandfather says that understanding grows, best in silence, like seeds in the earth." The elders nodded approvingly at her words. "The girl speaks wisdom," Elder Yoder said. "Perhaps this is how we should proceed. Not with announcements or explanations, but with quiet learning." A plan began to take shape over the remainder of breakfast. Morgan would spend time with different families in the community, learning their ways not as an observer but as a participant. In return, he would help them understand how to maintain their values while dealing with an increasingly intrusive outside world. "But first," Hannah said, firmly, "the morning chores wait for no discussion, no matter how important." The work that followed felt different from the previous days. Now there was purpose beyond simple learning. Each task came with its history, its significance in the community's life. Sarah taught Morgan how to harness the horses for plowing, explaining not just the practical steps, but the relationships built through working together. "The horse must trust thee," she said, guiding his hands along the leather straps. "And thee must trust the horse. It is like any relationship, built on respect and understanding." As the morning progressed, more community members arrived, each bringing food or offers of help with the daily work. Morgan noticed how they organized themselves without obvious direction, each person finding their place in the day's tasks. It was like watching a complex dance where everyone knew their part. Mid-morning brought news from the hospital. Joseph was doing well, but the doctors wanted to keep him for additional tests. David's wife Rachel arrived with the update and fresh clothes for Hannah. "The English doctors are kind," Rachel reported, "but they do not understand why Joseph refuses their television or why he wants to conduct his business meetings from his hospital bed." "Business meetings?" Morgan asked, pausing in his work of helping to repair a fence. Hannah smiled. "Joseph believes that if he must rest his body, he will at least keep his mind active. He has asked that community members bring their questions and concerns to him there." The image of the Amish elder holding court in his hospital room, probably confounding the medical staff with his mixture of ancient wisdom and practical problem-solving, made Morgan smile. But it also highlighted the unique opportunity he'd been given to witness this intersection of worlds. As the day continued, Morgan found himself drawn into increasingly deep conversations with various community members. Each interaction revealed new layers of understanding about how the Amish balanced tradition with necessity. Mary Stoltzfus, while teaching him the proper way to check beehives, explained their approach to education. "We teach our children to think, not just to learn," she said, carefully lifting a frame heavy with honey. "The English schools teach many facts, but do they teach wisdom?" Later, working with young Samuel Yoder to repair a wind-damaged roof, Morgan learned about the community's approach to technology. "We ask always, will this thing bring us closer together or push us apart?" Samuel explained. "It is not the thing itself that matters, but its effect on our relationships." The afternoon brought an unexpected challenge when a particularly persistent reporter managed to find her way onto the property. Morgan was working in the garden with Sarah when they heard the commotion, quick footsteps, and the unmistakable sound of a camera shutter. Before Morgan could react, Sarah stepped forward, placing herself between the reporter and the garden. "Friend," she said firmly but kindly, "Dee is not invited here." The reporter, a young woman clutching a professional camera, seemed taken aback by the quiet authority in the girl's voice. "I'm just trying to understand why Morgan Freeman is hiding out on an Amish farm," she said, raising her camera again. "Understanding cannot be taken," Sarah replied. "It must be given, and today, it is not being given." Morgan watched, impressed, as Sarah's quiet dignity accomplished what no security team had ever managed. The reporter lowered her camera, looking somewhat ashamed. "I apologize," she said finally. "I didn't think about it that way." Sarah nodded, accepting the apology with grace. "Perhaps thee would like to join us for dinner next week when things are calmer, without thy camera." The reporter's surprise was evident, but before she could respond, several community members appeared to escort her politely but firmly from the property. The incident, however, sparked an important discussion over the afternoon meal. "We cannot hide from the world," Elder Stoltzfus observed, breaking his bread thoughtfully. "But we can choose how we meet it. The question," added Rachel, "is how to share understanding without becoming a spectacle." Morgan, who had decades of experience managing public attention, found himself in the unique position of helping the community navigate this challenge. "Perhaps," he suggested, "we can use their curiosity to share something meaningful rather than just satisfying it." The conversation that followed lasted well into the evening, continuing even as they moved to the barn for milking. Ideas were proposed, considered, and either adapted or discarded based on how well they aligned with the community's values. As the day drew to a close, Morgan received a call from Joseph at the hospital. The elder's voice was stronger, but his words carried the weight of important news. "The doctors say I must stay another week," Joseph said. "But perhaps this is God's way of giving us time to prepare. The world is curious about us now because of thee. We must decide how to use this attention wisely." "I've been thinking about that," Morgan replied, watching the sunset paint the barn in shades of gold. "What if we turned this into an opportunity for real understanding, not just about the Amish way of life, but about why choosing a simpler path might be exactly what many people need to hear right now?" Joseph was quiet for a moment. "Thee speaks of using thy skill with stories to share our truth?" "Yes, but not as entertainment. As wisdom. The world is hungry for authentic voices, Joseph. They just don't always know where to look for them." The elder's response was thoughtful. "Tomorrow come to the hospital, bring Sarah. She sees clearly what many of us sometimes miss. We will talk more about this idea." As Morgan prepared to leave for the day, Hannah pressed a loaf of fresh bread into his hands. "For thy dinner," she said, "and to remind thee that the simplest things often carry the most meaning." Sarah walked with him to his car, her quiet presence a reminder of how much he'd learned in just a few days. "Will thee return tomorrow?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Yes," Morgan replied, carefully placing the bread on the passenger seat. "There's still so much to learn." "Good," she nodded. "Because grandfather says thee has only begun to understand the real lessons." Driving back through the gathering dusk, Morgan reflected on the day's events. His phone showed dozens of missed calls from his agent, several text messages from concerned friends, and at least one strongly worded email from a studio executive about his missed appointments. But none of that seemed as important as what he'd witnessed today. A community that had found ways to preserve what mattered while thoughtfully engaging with change. There were lessons here that went far beyond simple lifestyle choices. At his hotel, he found a small package waiting for him. Inside was a handwritten journal and a note from Joseph, apparently arranged before his hospital stay. For recording, what thee learns. Sometimes wisdom reveals itself only when we take time to reflect on it. Morgan sat down with the journal, its plain leather cover and simple pages reflecting the aesthetic of the community he was coming to understand. He began to write, not about the day's events exactly, but about the deeper currents he was beginning to perceive. Today I learned that wisdom doesn't shout, he wrote. It whispers in the space between words, in the rhythm of shared work, in the quiet confidence of a young girl facing down the modern world with nothing but truth as her shield. He continued writing late into the night, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new understanding. The media attention would increase, the pressure to explain himself would grow. But somehow none of that seemed as important as getting these words right, as capturing the essence of what he was experiencing. In the morning, he would face all the complications that came with being Morgan Freeman, taking an unexpected sabbatical in Amish country. But for now he was simply a student of a different way of living, recording lessons that no script could have taught him. The last thing he wrote before sleep was a quote from Sarah that seemed to sum up everything he was learning. We do not choose the simple life because it is easy, but because it makes room for what matters most. The morning light filtered through the hospital window, casting gentle shadows across Joseph's bed as Morgan and Sarah arrived for their meeting. The room had been transformed in subtle ways that spoke volumes about the intersection of worlds taking place within it. Modern medical equipment blinked and hummed alongside a hand-stitched quilt from home. A simple wooden chair, brought by the community, stood next to the standard hospital furniture. Joseph sat upright, his beard neatly combed, wearing his own clothes rather than a hospital gown, a small but significant assertion of identity in this foreign environment. His eyes brightened at their arrival, though Morgan noticed the lingering fatigue in his features. Ah, good, Joseph said, gesturing to the chairs. We have much to discuss, and these English doctors seem to think I have nothing but time. His gentle humor masked the seriousness of his condition, but not completely. Sarah moved immediately to adjust her grandfather's pillows, her practiced movements suggesting she'd done this many times before. Mother sent fresh bread, she said, placing a carefully wrapped package on his bedside table. And Elder Stoltzfus asks for thy guidance about the new schoolhouse plans. Always something needing attention, Joseph nodded. But first, let us address the matter at hand. He turned to Morgan. The world outside is very interested in thy presence among us. This morning's newspaper spoke of it. Morgan had seen the headlines himself. Oscar winner goes Amish, and Hollywood star's strange sabbatical. The stories were mostly speculation, mixed with recycled facts about Amish life and his career. They're missing the real story, Morgan said, settling into the wooden chair. They're looking for sensation when there's wisdom to be found. Joseph's eyes crinkled with approval. Thee begins to understand, but now we must decide how to help others understand as well. He paused as a nurse entered to check his vital signs, waiting patiently as she worked. The young woman's movements were efficient but gentle, respecting her patient's dignity. After she left, Joseph continued, Our ways are not secret, but they are often misunderstood. We do not seek to convert others to our path, but perhaps we can help them understand why we choose it. Sarah, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. Like the parable of the lantern, Grandfather, we need not shout to be seen if our light shines true. Exactly so, Joseph nodded. Morgan, thee has spent thy life telling stories that help people understand different ways of living. How might we use that gift here, without turning our life into mere entertainment? The question hung in the air as Morgan considered the challenge. Outside the room, hospital life continued its steady rhythm. Monitors beeping, staff discussing, cases, patients being wheeled to tests. The contrast between this modern efficiency and the timeless wisdom they were discussing wasn't lost on him. What if, Morgan began slowly. We approach this as a conversation rather than a presentation, not just about Amish life, but about what it means to choose your path deliberately in a world that often moves too fast to think. Joseph's expression showed interest. Continue. The world is hungry for authenticity, Morgan explained, drawing on decades of experience in storytelling. People feel disconnected, overwhelmed by technology and constant change. Your community has found ways to maintain connection, to faith, to family, to purpose. That's not just an Amish story. It's a human story. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. David entered, carrying more community matters requiring Joseph's attention. But instead of asking them to leave, Joseph invited his son to join the conversation. What thinks thee of this idea? Joseph asked David after Morgan had explained further. To share our ways not as curiosities but as examples of choosing life deliberately? David, who had always been the most cautious about Morgan's presence, considered carefully before responding. The English already see us as living history, something to photograph through car windows. How would this be different? Because, Sarah interjected with unexpected passion, this time we would be sharing our wisdom, not just our appearance, like when Thee explains to the English farmers why we choose our methods, not because we fear change, but because we understand the value of what might be lost. David looked at his daughter with surprise and pride. When did thee become so wise? She learns from a good teacher, Joseph said softly, reaching for Sarah's hand. The moment of family connection was interrupted by another round of medical staff, this time including Dr. Peterson, Joseph's primary physician. Mr. Miller, the doctor began, reviewing his charts. Your tests show improvement, but we'd like to discuss some longer-term treatment options. He paused, noting the full room. Perhaps in private? These are my family, Joseph said firmly, and Mr. Freeman has become a trusted friend. What thee has to say can be said to all. What followed was a fascinating intersection of modern medicine and traditional values. Dr. Peterson explained the benefits of various medications and lifestyle changes, while Joseph and his family listened attentively, asking questions that revealed their own deep understanding of healing. Your community's health outcomes are actually quite remarkable in some areas, Dr. Peterson noted. Lower stress levels, stronger social connections, more physical activity. We're starting to understand how important these factors are. Perhaps, Morgan suggested, this is another area where both worlds could learn from each other. The conversation shifted to a broader discussion of how traditional wisdom and modern knowledge might complement each other. Joseph's medical situation had created an unexpected opportunity for dialogue between two very different approaches to life and healing. As the morning wore on, more visitors arrived, community members seeking Joseph's counsel, hospital staff curious about their unusual patient, even a few other patients who had heard about the Amish elder sharing wisdom from his hospital bed. Morgan watched as Joseph handled each interaction with grace and purpose, turning every conversation into an opportunity for understanding. It was a masterclass in communication, in finding common ground without compromising one's values. During a quiet moment, when Sarah had gone to fetch fresh water and David was speaking with the doctors, Joseph turned to Morgan with a more personal observation. These seems different from when we first met, he said. More at peace, perhaps. Morgan considered this. I've spent my career playing wise men, he replied. But here, I'm learning what wisdom really looks like in practice. It's humbling. Humility is the beginning of wisdom, Joseph nodded. But it is not the end. What will thee do with what thee learns here? Before Morgan could respond, Sarah returned with unexpected news. The English reporter, the one from yesterday, she's here, in the hospital. She's asking to speak with us. Joseph's eyes met Morgan's. Perhaps this is an opportunity to begin what we discussed. Shall we show her what real understanding looks like? The reporter, when she was invited in, seemed surprised by the welcome she received. She had come prepared for resistance but found herself instead drawn into a conversation about choices, values, and the search for meaning in modern life. "You're not what I expected," she admitted after an hour of discussion. "I came looking for a story about Morgan Freeman going Amish, but there's something much more important happening here, isn't there?" "There usually is," Joseph replied, "if we take time to look beneath the surface." As the day progressed, more pieces of their larger purpose began to fall into place. The reporter's presence, initially seen as an intrusion, became a catalyst for articulating the deeper messages they hoped to share. Morgan found himself acting as a bridge between worlds in ways he hadn't anticipated. His experience in media helped shape their message, while his growing understanding of Amish values kept that message authentic. Late in the afternoon, as shadows lengthened across the hospital room, Hannah arrived with fresh clothes and news from the farm. The community had been discussing their plans, she reported. There was broad support for sharing their wisdom, though concerns remained about maintaining their way of life amid increased attention. The young people especially, Hannah noted, see an opportunity to help others understand why we choose this path. They tire of being seen as relics. "We are not relics," Sarah said firmly. "We are living proof that there are different ways to be in the world." Joseph smiled at his granddaughter's words. "And that, perhaps, is the heart of what we wish to share. Not that our way is the only way, but that each person must choose their path with purpose and understanding." As evening approached, Morgan prepared to leave for the day. The hospital was shifting to night staffing and Joseph needed rest. But before he left, Joseph had one more piece of wisdom to share. "Tomorrow," he said, "go with David to the elders' meeting. They will want to hear our plans, and these should be part of that discussion. But first, spend the morning in silence. Work with thy hands. Let the wisdom of physical labor prepare thy mind for important words." Morgan nodded, understanding now that this wasn't just advice, it was a demonstration of the very principles they hoped to share with the world. The integration of physical work, spiritual reflection, and community decision-making was at the heart of Amish wisdom. Driving back through the countryside, Morgan noticed details he might have missed before. The way the farms were laid out to promote community interaction, how the absence of power lines changed the landscape, the rhythm of horse-drawn buggies moving unhurried along the roads. At his hotel, he found more messages waiting. His agent had scheduled a press conference without consulting him, assuming he'd want to explain his situation. Studio executives were threatening to recast his roles. Social media was buzzing with theories about his disappearance. None of it seemed as important as what he'd witnessed today. He took out Joseph's journal and began to write, reflecting on how his understanding had deepened. The words came easily now, shaped by the rhythm of farm work and the wisdom of unhurried conversation. "Today I learned that wisdom isn't just about knowing things," he wrote. "It's about knowing why things matter, and having the courage to choose what matters most." He continued writing late into the night, preparing for tomorrow's meeting with the elders. But his preparation wasn't about crafting persuasive arguments or rehearsing speeches. Instead, he focused on understanding more deeply why this message mattered, not just for the Amish community or for his own journey, but for a world that had perhaps forgotten how to choose its path with purpose. The last thing he wrote before sleep was a question Joseph had asked earlier. What will thee do with what thee learns here? The answer, he realized, was still unfolding. But it would shape not just the next few days or weeks, but perhaps the rest of his life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The elders' meeting, the growing media attention, the need to balance two very different worlds. But for now, in the quiet of his hotel room, Morgan Freeman, the man who had played God in movies, found himself humbled by the real wisdom he was encountering. Tomorrow would come soon enough, with all its complications. Tonight was for reflection, for letting the day's lessons settle into understanding. Outside his window, the stars were visible again, bright and clear in the Lancaster County sky. Somewhere in the hospital, Joseph was probably sharing more wisdom with the night staff. And on the farm, the Miller family was preparing for another day of purposeful work and thoughtful living. Morgan smiled at the thought of how far he'd come from that first wrong turn down a country road. Sometimes, he reflected, Getting lost was the best way to find what you didn't know you were looking for. The morning of the elders' meeting dawned with unexpected chaos. Morgan arrived at the Miller farm to find the peaceful property transformed by a scene that made his heart sink. Overnight, someone had leaked the exact location of the farm to social media. Now dozens of cars lined the country road, and a small army of reporters and curious onlookers pressed against the property's fence line. Several news vans had set up satellite dishes, their crews preparing for live broadcasts. Sarah met him at the back entrance, her face tight with worry. "They began arriving before sunrise," she said quietly. "Some tried to enter the barn. Father has called the sheriff." But it wasn't just the media invasion that had shattered the morning's peace. As Morgan followed Sarah to the house, he noticed David in intense discussion with several other community members. Their usual calm demeanors were marked by obvious distress. Hannah met them at the kitchen door, her expression grave. "We've received word from the hospital," she said without preamble. "Joseph's condition has worsened overnight, but that's not all." She glanced at Sarah before continuing. "Someone has leaked his medical records to the press." Morgan felt a cold anger settle in his stomach. He'd seen the darker side of media attention before, but this violation felt particularly egregious. "There's more," David said, joining them. He held up a tablet computer, something Morgan had never seen in their home before. "This was delivered anonymously this morning. It contains private footage from inside our community, recorded over the past few days. Someone has been secretly filming us." The revelation landed like a physical blow. The tablet itself was a stark symbol of the very invasion they were discussing. Sarah reached for it with trembling hands, her eyes wide as she watched snippets of their private lives playing out on the screen. Intimate family moments, community gatherings, even scenes from Joseph's hospital room. "They've been watching us all along," she whispered, "even when we thought we were alone." But the true twist revealed itself when they played the final video on the device. It showed a series of meetings between a Hollywood production company, executive, and several young members of their community. The meetings had taken place in secret, away from the elders' oversight. "Some of our young people," David explained, his voice heavy with disappointment, "have been negotiating to sell our story, our way of life, for a reality television show. They believed they were helping to preserve our traditions by documenting them." The irony was painful. The very thing they had been carefully considering, how to share their wisdom meaningfully, had been undermined by this unauthorized attempt to commercialize their life. Morgan watched as the implications rippled through the gathered family members. This wasn't just about privacy invaded, it was about trust betrayed, about the complex challenges of preserving tradition in a world that sought to commodify everything it touched. "There's something else," Hannah said, holding a letter. "The hospital board is meeting this morning. Some members are concerned about the attention Joseph's presence is bringing. They're discussing transferring him to a different facility." The news hit like successive waves, each revelation compounding the crisis. But before they could process further, Sarah's phone, used only for emergency family communication, rang. With urgent news from the hospital, Joseph had taken a turn for the worse. The doctors were concerned about complications, and he was asking for his family. But with the media circus outside, even getting to the hospital would be a challenge. Morgan looked at the chaos unfolding around them. The media crews outside, the betrayal from within their community, the medical crisis, and the growing pressure from all sides. Everything they had worked to protect seemed to be unraveling at once. Then, unexpectedly, Sarah stepped forward. Her voice, though quiet, carried the strength that Morgan had come to recognize as a hallmark of their community's resilience. "Grandfather has been teaching us about choosing our response to the world's challenges," she said. "Perhaps this is our test, to show how we handle crisis with grace." Her words seemed to shift something in the room. David straightened, his features settling into determined calm. Hannah nodded, already beginning to organize their response. Morgan found himself drawing on both his Hollywood experience and the wisdom he'd learned here. "We need to address this on multiple fronts," he said, "but we need to do it in a way that honors your values." What followed was a remarkable fusion of traditional wisdom and modern crisis management. The community mobilized with the same quiet efficiency they brought to barn raisings and harvests. But now their task was protecting their way of life from modern intrusion. David gathered the elders for an emergency meeting, not just to address the immediate crisis but to consider its deeper implications. Hannah organized a phone tree, one of their approved modern concessions, to warn other community members and coordinate their response. Morgan's role became clear when Sarah made a surprising suggestion. "Thee knows how to speak to the English media," she said. "Could thee help us tell our true story before the false one takes root?" But before they could implement any plans, a new complication arose. The young community members involved in the secret filming arrived at the farm, their faces showing a mix of shame and defiance. Among them was Jacob Stoltzfus, Sarah's childhood friend, who stepped forward to explain. "We thought we were helping," he said, his voice breaking. "The English producer said the world needs to see the beauty in our way of life. He said it would help preserve our traditions." The pain of good intentions gone wrong was visible on every face. These young people, caught between two worlds, had tried to bridge the gap in their own way, not seeing how their actions might threaten the very things they sought to protect. David's response surprised everyone. Instead of immediate judgment, he asked, "What made thee feel our traditions needed saving in this way?" The question opened a flood of honest discussion about the challenges young Amish faced in the modern world. Their fears about preservation, their struggle with visibility versus privacy, their desire to be understood rather than merely observed, all poured out in a conversation that had perhaps been too long delayed. As they talked, Morgan received an urgent call from the hospital. Joseph was awake and asking for him specifically. "Bring Sarah," the nurse said. "He's quite insistent." The challenge now was reaching the hospital through the media gauntlet. But here the crisis offered an unexpected solution. The young people who had been secretly filming knew all the back roads and private paths between farms. They could guide Morgan and Sarah to the hospital while avoiding the main roads where media had gathered. Before they left, Hannah pulled Morgan aside. "Joseph always says that challenges are opportunities dressed in work clothes," she said. "Perhaps this crisis is showing us something we needed to see." The drive to the hospital took them through rarely used farm lanes and quiet woodland paths. Sarah sat silently in the passenger seat, but her presence was anything but passive. She was watching, thinking, processing the morning's events with the same careful consideration her grandfather had taught her. They found Joseph awake and alert, despite the doctor's concerns. His room had become a sort of command center, with medical staff, hospital administrators, and even the hospital's PR team coming and going. "Ah," Joseph said when they entered, his voice weak but his eyes sharp. "Now we can begin to understand God's purpose in all this." Morgan was struck by how the elder's presence, even in his weakened state, seemed to center the chaos around them. Joseph listened as they reported the morning's events, his expression thoughtful rather than troubled. "So," he said finally, "our young people wish to preserve our ways through the English tools of documentation. The world wishes to see into our lives through their machines, and we find ourselves at the center of attention despite our desire for quiet." He paused, his breath catching slightly. "Perhaps we have been too focused on preservation and not enough on adaptation." Sarah looked up sharply. "Grandfather, every generation must find its own way to live our truths," Joseph continued. "We chose simplicity not because it is old but because it is right. But perhaps," he had to pause for breath, "perhaps how we share that truth must change with the times." The wisdom of his words was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. The hospital administrator entered, looking apologetic but firm. "Mr. Miller, I'm sorry, but with all this media attention, the board has decided nothing yet," came a new voice. Dr. Peterson strode in, looking both professional and protective. "And they won't until they understand what's really happening here." What followed was yet another layer of the unfolding situation. Dr. Peterson had been doing research on the health benefits of Amish lifestyle choices. The community's approach to stress, work, and community support had produced measurable positive outcomes. He'd been preparing to publish his findings when all this attention erupted. "What if," he suggested, looking between Joseph and Morgan, "we found a way to share these benefits with the wider world, but on your terms, not as entertainment, but as genuine wisdom?" Joseph's eyes met Morgan's, and in that moment a new understanding began to form. The crisis had forced everything into the open: the community's internal struggles with modernization, the young people's fears about preservation, the outside world's fascination with their way of life. "The truth," Joseph said slowly, "is that we have always adapted. We simply do it thoughtfully, with purpose." He reached for Sarah's hand. "Perhaps this crisis is showing us that it is time for a new kind of adaptation." Morgan watched as something shifted in Sarah's expression. She had been caught between worlds in her own way, loving her community's traditions while seeing the need for new forms of connection. "Grandfather," she said carefully, "what if we shared our story not through their cameras but through our own words? Not for entertainment, but for understanding?" Joseph smiled, though the effort clearly tired him. Now he begins to see the opportunity in the challenge. He turned to Morgan. "Friend, we have learned from thee about speaking to the wider world. Perhaps it is time to use that knowledge." The moment was interrupted by urgent news from the farm. The media presence had grown, and some reporters were now claiming to have insider information about conflicts within the community. The story was threatening to spin completely out of control. Joseph listened to this news with surprising calmness. "So," he said, "we must choose. Do we hide and let others tell our story? Or do we find a way to share our truth that honors both our traditions and the needs of the present?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Everything they had been discussing over the past days, about wisdom, about choosing one's path deliberately, about balancing tradition with necessity, had led to this moment. Morgan looked at Sarah, who had grown so much in understanding during these challenging days. He looked at Joseph, whose wisdom had somehow anticipated this crisis. He thought about the young community members whose misguided actions had sprung from a deep desire to preserve what they valued. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "this is exactly the story that needs to be told, not about the crisis, but about how you choose to handle it, about how wisdom guides us through challenges." Joseph nodded, his expression both tired and determined. "Then let us show them what it means to face change with purpose and grace." He squeezed Sarah's hand. "The world is watching now, whether we wish it or not. Let us give them something worthy of seeing." As if to emphasize the magnitude of the moment, a nurse entered with Joseph's latest test results. The news was both concerning and clarifying. His heart condition was stable but would require ongoing attention. He would need to find a way to balance his role as community elder with his health needs. "So," Joseph said, looking at each of them, "in turn, we all face the same challenge. How do we preserve what matters while adapting to what must change?" The question would shape everything that followed, though none of them could yet see exactly how. But in that hospital room, surrounded by the beeping of modern medical equipment while discussing ancient wisdom, they began to understand that sometimes the biggest crises bring the clearest opportunities. The next 24 hours unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of chaos and purpose. Morgan found himself at the center of three converging challenges: the media circus threatening to overwhelm the community, Joseph's deteriorating health, and the internal struggle of the Amish youth, caught between tradition and modernity. Dawn broke over the Miller farm with an unusual sight. The elders had gathered in the pre-morning darkness, their black buggies forming a circle around the main house. Inside, Morgan sat with David, Hannah, and Sarah as they prepared for what might be the most important day in their community's recent history. "The English media is calling it the Amish uprising," David said, his voice tight with controlled emotion as he read from a local newspaper. "They say our young people are rebelling, that our way of life is crumbling." He set the paper down carefully, his hands steady despite his obvious distress. Hannah, who had been up all night coordinating with other community families, added her own report. 3 more film crews arrived before sunrise. They're interviewing anyone who will talk, even making up stories when they can't find real ones to tell. Sarah, who had spent the night at the hospital with Joseph, looked exhausted but determined. Grandfather says we must act today. His doctors, she paused, gathering strength. They say his heart cannot take much more stress. Morgan absorbed these updates, his mind working on multiple levels. His Hollywood experience had taught him about managing media crises, but this was different. This wasn't about protecting a movie's opening weekend or a star's reputation. This was about preserving something far more precious while allowing it to evolve. Joseph shared something with me last night, Morgan said, his deep voice carrying the weight of careful consideration. He said, "Sometimes the best way to preserve a tree is to allow it to grow new branches." The room fell silent, considering these words. Outside, they could hear the first stirrings of the media crews setting, up for another day of siege. But inside this kitchen, with its oil lamps casting warm light on concerned faces, something important was taking shape. David spoke first, his words measured. "The elders have been in prayer and discussion all night. They've reached a decision that requires all of our help." He looked directly at Morgan, "including thine." The plan that emerged was both bold and deeply rooted in Amish principles. Instead of hiding from the media attention or fighting against it, they would transform it into a teaching moment. But they would do it their way, on their terms. "First," David explained, "we must gather everyone involved. The young people who made the recordings, the media representatives, even the hospital administrators. But not here, not on our farms where they hold the power of invasion." Hannah nodded, understanding. The meeting house. The Amish meeting house was rarely used outside of Sunday services and special community gatherings. Its choice as the location for this confrontation carried deep significance. "But before we can face the outside world," David continued, "we must heal our own community." He turned to Sarah. "Will thee help gather the young people? They trust thee, and they need to understand their part in what's to come." Sarah straightened, accepting this responsibility. "They're scared," she said. "Not just of punishment, but of losing everything they value. Like Jacob said yesterday, they thought they were helping preserve our ways." Morgan watched as the family dynamic shifted and aligned. Each person found their role in the unfolding plan, drawing on strengths they perhaps hadn't known they possessed until this crisis forced them to emerge. The next few hours were a blur of purposeful activity. Morgan worked with David to craft a message that would reach both worlds without compromising either. Hannah coordinated with other families, ensuring everyone understood their part. Sarah disappeared on a borrowed horse, riding out to gather the troubled youth who had inadvertently sparked this crisis. By mid-morning, the meeting house grounds had been prepared. Simple benches were arranged in the traditional way, but with a purpose that was anything but traditional. The elders had agreed to allow limited photography, a concession that showed just how serious they were about this moment. Joseph, against his doctor's advice but with their grudging support, insisted on being present. He arrived in a plain, black buggy attended by Dr. Peterson, who had become an unexpected ally in bridging the medical and spiritual aspects of this crisis. As the young people began to arrive, their heads bowed but their steps determined, Morgan witnessed something remarkable. Instead of judgment, the elders greeted each one with the same quiet respect they always showed. There was sadness in their eyes, yes, but also understanding. The media crews, when they arrived, found themselves facing something they hadn't expected. Instead of angry confrontation or evasive hiding, they were met with calm purpose. They were asked, not told, but asked, to respect certain boundaries. Many of them, surprised by this approach, found themselves setting aside their usual aggressive tactics. Morgan watched as Sarah gathered the young people in a corner of the meeting house grounds. Jacob Stoltzfus, the unofficial leader of the group that had made the recordings, stood slightly apart, his struggle visible in every line of his body. "The nose," Sarah said to him, just loud enough for Morgan to overhear. "Grandfather always says that mistakes are just wisdom waiting to be understood. The boy looked up, hope flickering across his features. Does he truly say that? He does. And now he needs our help to show everyone what that means. As the morning progressed, more pieces of their plan fell into place. The hospital administrators arrived, looking uncomfortable in this simple setting but gradually relaxing as they were included in the unfolding story. Dr. Peterson had prepared a presentation about the health benefits of Amish lifestyle choices, backed by real research rather than sensational claims. But the most powerful moment of preparation came when Joseph gathered everyone, family, youth, elders, and visitors, for a moment of silence before the main event. In that quiet, with only the sound of wind in the trees and distant birdsong, something shifted. Morgan, standing near Joseph's chair, heard the elder whisper, "Now we shall see if we can teach what we have learned." The media had been asked to wait outside until everything was ready. Through the meeting house windows, Morgan could see them setting up their equipment, but somehow their presence seemed less invasive now. They too would be part of this lesson, though they didn't yet know. Sarah approached Morgan, her face showing both nervousness and determination. "Grandfather wants thee to speak first," she said, "to help them understand why thee came here before we show them what thee found." Morgan nodded, understanding the wisdom of this approach. His presence had sparked this crisis, but it could also help resolve it. He thought about everything he'd learned in these past days, about simplicity chosen with purpose, about wisdom lived rather than just spoken, about the courage it takes to maintain one's values while facing change. David joined them, carrying the tablet that had caused so much distress. "We've watched all the recordings," he said quietly. "There is pain in seeing our private moments exposed, but there is also truth. Perhaps—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Perhaps God has given us a way to share our message that we would not have chosen ourselves." The young filmmakers, watching anxiously from their corner, couldn't hear this conversation, but they could see their elders handling their recordings with consideration rather than condemnation. More than one pair of eyes filled with tears. Hannah appeared with a practical concern. "The English reporters are asking about electricity for their equipment. They don't understand that we've chosen not to have it here." This logistical challenge became yet another opportunity for teaching. The solution, when it emerged, was perfectly aligned with their principles. The media would need to adapt to their environment rather than the other way around. Battery-powered equipment only, no bright lights, no intrusive microphones. As noon approached, Joseph asked to speak privately with Morgan. In a quiet corner of the meeting house, the elder's voice was weak, but his words were clear. "Today," he said, "we face a choice that every generation of our people has faced. How do we remain true to our principles while engaging with a world that constantly demands change?" He paused, gathering strength. "But perhaps that is not the real question. Perhaps the real question is, how do we show others that choosing simplicity is not about rejecting progress but about protecting what matters most?" Morgan thought carefully before responding. "In Hollywood, we tell stories to help people understand different ways of living. But here, I've learned that the most powerful stories are the ones lived authentically every day." Joseph nodded, pleased. "Then that is what we shall show them. Not a performance, but a truth." He gripped Morgan's hand with surprising strength. "Thee has become part of our story now. Help us tell it well." The final preparations took on an almost ceremonial quality. The young people, under Sarah's guidance, arranged their recording equipment alongside the modern media's cameras, a visual representation of the bridge they were trying to build between worlds. Dr. Peterson set up his research materials, ready to provide scientific support for what the Amish had known through generations of lived experience. The hospital administrators, seeing their patient in this context, began to understand why maintaining his connection to this community was as important as any medical treatment. As the appointed hour drew near, Morgan observed the scene with a storyteller's eye. The meeting house, with its simple architecture and purposeful design, had become a stage for something unprecedented. But unlike a Hollywood set, everything here was authentically, powerfully real. Sarah appeared at his elbow, her quiet presence grounding him in the moment. "Is thee ready?" she asked. Morgan looked at the gathering crowd, the concerned elders, the hopeful young people, the curious media representatives, all waiting to understand what was about to unfold. He thought about his own journey, from lost actor to engaged, student of a deeper wisdom. "I'm ready," he said. "But more importantly, I think we're all ready to learn something here today." Joseph, watching from his chair, smiled slightly. Even in his weakened state, his presence commanded attention. He had positioned himself where everyone, community members and visitors alike, could see him. His physical frailty seemed to emphasize the strength of his spirit. The time had come. David stepped forward to open the meeting house doors fully, symbolically inviting the world to witness not a scandal, but a lesson in handling change with grace and purpose. Morgan took his position, feeling the weight of multiple worlds resting on what would happen next. Behind him, he could hear Sarah gathering the young people, their nervous energy contained by her calm presence. The elders sat in their traditional places, their faces showing not anger but patient expectation. This was more than a press conference or a community meeting. It was a moment of transformation, carefully prepared, but ultimately unpredictable. Everything they had worked toward, everything they had learned would be tested in what came next. Joseph's voice, though quiet, carried clearly in the hushed atmosphere. "Begin," he said simply. "Show them what wisdom looks like when it faces change." The meeting house fell into profound silence as Morgan Freeman stepped forward. Camera lights dimmed respectfully, and even the most hardened reporters seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. This wasn't going to be an ordinary press conference or community meeting. Something far more significant was about to unfold. Morgan's deep, familiar voice filled the space with measured authority. "I've played many roles in my life," he began, "but none has taught me more than being a student here these past days." He paused, making eye contact with various faces in the crowd. "I came here by accident. A wrong turn that turned out to be exactly right." The media representatives leaned forward, sensing a story different from what they'd expected. The young Amish people, still uncertain of their fate, watched intently as Morgan continued. "You've all come here expecting a story about conflict, about tradition versus progress, about young versus old, about a community in crisis." He gestured to the tablet containing the secret recordings. "But what you're about to witness is something far more important, a lesson in how wisdom handles change." Joseph, sitting in his chair with quiet dignity, nodded slightly. This was the opening they had planned, but its impact was already exceeding expectations. The reporters' pens had stopped moving as they listened, truly listened, perhaps for the first time. Morgan stepped aside, making way for Sarah and Jacob to come forward. The young people moved with a mixture of trepidation and determination. Jacob's hands trembled slightly as he held up the tablet that had caused so much turmoil. "We thought we were preserving our way of life," Jacob said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "We thought if people could see the beauty of our traditions, they would understand why we choose this path." Sarah picked up the thread seamlessly. "But we learned something important through our mistake. True preservation isn't about capturing images or holding on to the past. It's about living our values in the present." The elders, watching from their bench, showed no reaction, but their attention was absolute. This was the moment when their young people would either justify their faith or confirm their fears. Jacob continued, his voice thick with emotion. "We betrayed our community's trust, but in doing so, we forced everyone, ourselves included, to face a question we've been avoiding. How do we maintain our ways in a world that increasingly demands to be seen and heard?" At this point, Joseph indicated he wished to speak. The room fell even quieter as David and Hannah helped him to his feet. Despite his physical weakness, his presence commanded absolute attention. "When I was young," Joseph began, his voice soft but clear, "my grandfather told me something I never forgot. He said, 'The world will always change. Our task is not to resist change, but to change wisely.'" He paused, gathering strength. "Today we face such a moment of choice." Dr. Peterson stepped forward then, his research materials ready. "But before, He could begin his presentation about the health benefits of Amish lifestyle choices. Something unexpected happened. One of the more aggressive reporters stood up. "I don't understand," she said, her voice carrying a note of genuine confusion rather than challenge. "You have young people secretly filming your lives, a Hollywood star living among you, and a medical crisis forcing you to engage with modern healthcare. How is this not the end of your traditional way of life?" The question hung in the air, its bluntness a stark contrast to the measured tone of the proceedings, but instead of causing offense, it seemed to crystallize the very issue they were there to address. Joseph smiled, and in that smile was decades of accumulated wisdom. "Come forward, friend," he said to the reporter. "Let me show you something." "The reporter approached uncertainly. Joseph reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. From it, he extracted a handful of seeds. "These are from the same strain of wheat my grandfather planted," he said. "We save seeds each year, choosing the strongest, preserving what works best. But each year, the plants grow slightly different, adapting to new conditions. Are they no longer traditional because they've adapted to survive?" The simplicity and power of the metaphor seemed to strike everyone present. Camera shutters clicked softly, capturing not just the image but the moment of understanding. Morgan watched as Joseph continued, speaking now, not just to the reporter but to everyone present. "We choose simplicity not because it is old, but because it is wise. We live apart not because we fear the world but because we fear losing what matters most: community, faith, purpose." Sarah stepped forward again, this time with the tablet. "These recordings our young people made. They show our daily lives, our work, our gatherings. But what they really captured, without realizing it, was something more important." She pressed play. The meeting house filled with images projected onto a simple white cloth. Scenes of community life played out. Families working together in fields. Children learning from elders, neighbors helping neighbors. But now, seen through the lens of Joseph's wisdom, these weren't just documentations of an antiquated lifestyle. They were demonstrations of principles that the modern world desperately needed to remember. "Look," Sarah said, her voice stronger, now. "Not at our clothes or our tools, but at how we live. Every choice has a purpose. Every action considers its effect on the community. Every decision asks not, 'What do I want?' but 'What serves the greater good?'" The young filmmakers watching their work displayed in this context began to see their own community through new eyes. What they had thought needed preserving was actually very much alive, not in the images they'd captured, but in the wisdom being demonstrated right now. Dr. Peterson chose this moment to add his perspective. "My research shows something remarkable," he said, displaying his findings. "The health benefits of this community's lifestyle choices aren't just physical. Their approach to stress, to community support, to purposeful living, these are exactly what modern medicine is now recognizing as crucial for overall well-being." Joseph nodded. "We did not choose these ways because science proved them right. We chose them because wisdom showed them true. That your science now confirms this is not surprising. Truth is truth, whether discovered through microscopes or learned through generations of living." The meeting house had become absolutely still. Even the most skeptical reporters were putting down their cameras, caught up in something larger than their original story. Morgan stepped forward again, but this time he spoke not as a Hollywood star or even as a narrator, but as someone transformed by what he had witnessed. "I've spent my career telling stories that help people understand different ways of living. But here, I've learned that the most powerful story isn't told, it's lived." He turned to face the young people who had made the recordings. "Your mistake wasn't in wanting to share your community's wisdom with the world. Your mistake was in thinking that wisdom could be captured on camera rather than demonstrated through actions." Joseph struggled to his feet again, waving away helping hands. Despite his physical weakness, his voice carried moral authority that filled the room. "So now, we face our moment of choice. The world has found us whether we wished it or not. The question is not whether we will engage with it, but how we will do so while remaining true to our principles." He turned to the assembled media representatives. You came here expecting to document our crisis. Instead, we invite you to witness our solution." He gestured to the young filmmakers. "These young people will work with their elders to create something new. Not a reality show that exploits our differences, but a teaching program that shares our wisdom." The proposal hung in the air for a moment before Joseph continued. "But it will be done our way. No cameras in our homes. No invasion of private moments. Instead, we will share our principles through demonstration and teaching. Those who wish to learn may come, but as students, not spectators." Morgan watched as understanding dawned across different faces in the room. This wasn't damage control or crisis management. It was transformation, carefully guided by wisdom that bridged past and present. Sarah stepped forward one final time, now speaking with quiet confidence. "Grandfather always says that wisdom isn't in knowing what to keep, but in knowing why we keep it. Today we're not choosing between tradition and progress. We're choosing to progress thoughtfully, guided by tradition." The young filmmakers, led by Jacob, stood as one. "We offer our skills," Jacob said, "not to expose our way of life, but to help share its wisdom. If the elders will guide us, we can use these tools to serve our community's true purpose." Joseph smiled, and in that smile was pride, forgiveness, and hope. "And so we find our way forward, not by rejecting change but by changing wisely, not by hiding our light but by sharing it purposefully." The media representatives who had come expecting scandal found themselves part of something far more newsworthy. A story about wisdom transforming crisis into opportunity, about tradition finding new ways to speak to the modern world. Dr. Peterson added his final observation. "What we're witnessing here isn't just conflict resolution. It's a demonstration of how traditional wisdom can guide us through modern challenges. My research shows the health benefits of this lifestyle. But today I've seen something even more valuable. The health of a community that knows how to face change without losing its soul." As the formal meeting drew to a close, something remarkable happened. The reporters, instead of rushing to file their stories, stayed. They asked questions, not about controversy, but about wisdom. They listened as elders explained principles of community living. They watched as young people demonstrated how traditional skills could address modern problems. Morgan observed it all with deep satisfaction. This wasn't an ending, but a beginning. A new chapter in a story as old as human community itself. The crisis had been transformed into an opportunity for genuine understanding. Joseph, exhausted but peaceful, beckoned Morgan to his side. "Thee has helped us find a way to speak to the world without losing our voice," he said softly. "Now we must help these young people learn to use their new tools with wisdom." As the afternoon light slanted through the meeting house windows, Morgan looked around at what had been accomplished. The young filmmakers were already in deep discussion with their elders, planning how to share their community's wisdom appropriately. The media representatives were engaging in thoughtful conversations about substance rather than sensation. Even the hospital administrators were seeing their patient in a new light, not just as a medical case but as a teacher whose wisdom complemented their science. Sarah caught his eye from across the room and smiled. Not the uncertain smile of a young girl, but the confident smile of someone who had found her role in bridging worlds. She was already organizing the practical details of what would come, next demonstrating that wisdom in action is as important as wisdom in words. The day was ending, but something new was beginning. As Morgan helped Joseph to his feet, the elder whispered one final observation. "Sometimes the greatest wisdom is in knowing when to let the world in, and how to do it without losing your way." The transformation continued to unfold as the afternoon progressed. What had begun as a crisis meeting evolved into something resembling a traditional Amish gathering, but with a distinctly modern purpose. The young filmmakers, now understanding their role differently, began demonstrating their vision for how they could share their community's wisdom respectfully. Jacob set up his tablet to show a series of carefully edited clips. "These are the moments we captured that show our principles in action," he explained to a mixed group of elders and reporters. "Not our private ceremonies or family moments, but our daily work that demonstrates our values." The footage showed community barn raisings, collective harvests, and educational sessions where skills were passed down through generations. But now, guided by their new understanding, the young people focused on explaining the principles behind these activities rather than just their picturesque qualities. See here, Sarah pointed out during a scene of communal farming, how the work pattern promotes conversation and connection. This isn't just about growing food, it's about growing community. Joseph, watching from his chair, added his perspective. In your world, you have many machines that make work easier, but sometimes, choosing the harder path brings rewards that efficiency cannot measure. The media representatives were taking notes with a different kind of attention now. Gone was the sensationalist angle about rebellion and crisis. Instead, they were capturing insights about community building, sustainable living, and purposeful choice. Lessons their modern readers desperately needed. Dr. Peterson seized the opportunity to connect these traditional practices with his research findings. Look at these work patterns, he explained, pointing to his data. The combination of physical activity, social interaction, and purposeful labor creates exactly the conditions that modern medicine recognizes as optimal for both physical and mental health. Morgan observed how the young Amish people began to see their own traditions through new eyes. What they had feared might be lost to time was actually more relevant than ever. It just needed to be understood and shared in the right way. One of the younger reporters raised her hand. But how do you maintain these practices when the world around you is moving so fast? When everything is about instant gratification and constant connection? Joseph's answer captured the essence of their wisdom. We are not against progress, he said carefully. We are for purpose. Every change must answer the question, will this bring us closer together or push us further apart? Will it serve our community or fragment it? The meeting house had become a kind of living classroom, with different groups engaged in various discussions and demonstrations. The young filmmakers were showing their elders how modern technology could be used selectively and purposefully. The elders were sharing their decision-making processes for evaluating new practices. Even the children present were participating, demonstrating traditional games that taught cooperation over competition. Hannah, who had been quietly observing, added her perspective.
In our homes, we do not have television or internet. This is not because we fear these things, but because we value conversation and presence. When we gather in the evening, we share stories, discuss problems, sing together. Our children learn
by participating in real life, not by watching it through screens. This prompted a discussion about education that captured everyone's attention. The young Amish teachers explained their approach to learning, how academic knowledge was balanced with practical skills, how every lesson included its application in real life. In our schools, Sarah explained, we don't just learn facts. We learn why they matter and how to use them to serve others. The afternoon continued to unfold with more demonstrations and discussions. The young filmmakers, working with their elders' guidance, began planning how to document their community's wisdom in a way that respected their values, while sharing their insights with the wider world. Morgan, moving between different groups, noticed how the initial tension had transformed into purposeful engagement. The crisis had become a catalyst for something new, not a compromise of values, but a deeper understanding of how to maintain them in a changing world. As the day drew to a close, Joseph gathered everyone for a final observation. Despite his physical weakness, his words carried the weight of generations of wisdom. Today we have not just solved a problem, he said, his voice clear despite its softness. We have demonstrated our most important principle, that wisdom shows itself not in avoiding challenges but in how we face them together. The sun was setting as people began to leave the meeting house. The media representatives departed with stories very different from what they had expected to find. The young filmmakers walked with their elders, deep in discussion about how to proceed with their new mission. The hospital administrators had a new appreciation for their patients' spiritual as well as physical needs. Morgan helped Joseph to his buggy, where Hannah waited to take him home. The elder gripped Morgan's hand with surprising strength. Thee came here as an actor, Joseph said. But thee has become something more, a bridge between worlds. Will thee help us continue this work? Morgan looked around at the community that had taught him so much about authentic wisdom. I would be honored, he replied. But I think my role now is to learn more than to teach. Sarah, overhearing this exchange, smiled. Perhaps teaching and learning are the same thing when done with wisdom. As the buggies departed and the last cars pulled away, Morgan stood in the gathering dusk, reflecting on how much had changed since his wrong turn down that country road. The crisis had been resolved, but more importantly, it had been transformed into an opportunity for genuine understanding. The story that would be told about this day would not be one of conflict between old and new, but of wisdom finding new ways to speak to a world that desperately needed to listen. The young people had found a way to honor their traditions while engaging with modern tools. The elders had demonstrated how to face change without losing their essential values. And somewhere in between, a deeper truth had emerged. That wisdom isn't about choosing between tradition and progress, but about knowing how to progress without losing what matters most. 1 month later, Morgan Freeman stood once again in the Miller Farm's kitchen, watching the early morning light filter through spotless windows. The scene before him was both familiar and transformed, much like the community itself. Joseph sat at the head of the table, his health improved enough to return home but still requiring careful monitoring. Dr. Peterson's integration of traditional Amish healing practices with modern medical care had proven remarkably successful, becoming a model that the hospital was now studying for other patients. The English world calls it holistic medicine, Dr. Peterson had explained during his last visit. But this community has understood the connection between physical, spiritual, and community health for generations. The kitchen was busy with its usual morning activities, but there were subtle changes that spoke to the evolution taking place. Sarah and Jacob sat at one end of the table, carefully reviewing footage on their tablet, now used only for their community-approved documentation project. Their young faces showed the serious purpose they brought to their new role as bridges between worlds. "We've finished the first teaching series," Sarah reported, turning the tablet so Joseph could see. "Simple demonstrations of our daily work, with explanations of the principles behind them. No private moments, no ceremonies, just the wisdom in our ordinary days." Joseph nodded approvingly. The project had taken shape under his guidance, transforming from a potential source of exploitation into a carefully considered sharing of wisdom. The young people had proven themselves worthy of the trust placed in them. Hannah, moving efficiently between stove and table, added her own observation. "The English visitors who came yesterday, did thee notice how differently they behaved from the first groups? They came to learn, not just to look." Indeed, the community's response to the crisis had led to an unexpected development. Instead of becoming a tourist attraction or media sensation, they had established what Joseph called a wisdom exchange, structured opportunities for outsiders to learn from their way of life, but on the community's terms. Morgan, sipping his morning coffee, still Hannah's concession to their English guest, reflected on how much had changed since his wrong turn down that country road. The story that had emerged from their crisis had captured public imagination in ways no one had expected. The world was hungry for something real, he mused aloud. Not just entertainment or sensation, but authentic wisdom about how to live with purpose. David, who had just returned from the barn, joined the conversation. "The young people from other communities have been writing to us," he reported. "They face similar struggles with modern pressures. Our experience has given them hope that there's a way forward that doesn't require choosing between tradition and truth." The morning unfolded with its usual rhythm of work and conversation, but now there was a new layer of purpose to their activities. The documentation project had made them more conscious of the wisdom embedded in their daily routines, more articulate about the principles that guided their choices. Jacob, who had once feared being caught between worlds, now moved confidently between his traditional responsibilities and his role in sharing their community's wisdom. "We're not just preserving our ways," he explained as he prepared to film that day's activities. "We're showing why they matter, especially now." The project had evolved far beyond its original scope. What had started as a potential reality show had become a series of thoughtful demonstrations and teachings about purposeful living, community building, and conscious choice. Universities had expressed interest in studying their decision-making processes. Environmental groups were learning from their sustainable practices. Mental health professionals were examining their approaches to community support and stress management. Sarah had emerged as a natural teacher, her quiet confidence growing as she helped visitors understand the principles behind their practices. "We don't teach them to be Amish," she explained to Morgan. "We teach them to be thoughtful about their own choices." As the morning progressed, Morgan accompanied Joseph on his daily walk around the farm, a practice Dr. Peterson had prescribed as part of his recovery. The elder moved more slowly now, but his mind remained sharp as ever. "Thee sees how God brings good from challenge?" Joseph asked, pausing to observe a group of young people working in the fields. They were demonstrating traditional farming methods to visiting agricultural students, explaining not just the techniques but the community principles that made them sustainable. "The world came looking for controversy," Morgan replied, "but found wisdom instead." Joseph smiled. "And thee? What has thee found here?" Morgan considered the question carefully. His agent had been calling regularly, offering increasingly lucrative film roles. But something had shifted in his understanding of purpose and impact. "I've found a different kind of story to tell," he said finally. "Not one that ends when the cameras stop rolling, but one that keeps teaching through how it's lived." They watched as Sarah led a group of visitors toward the barn, her clear voice carrying across the morning air as she explained the principles behind their approach to animal care. The visitors, professionals from various fields, took notes and asked thoughtful questions. "She has found her calling," Joseph observed proudly. "Not just preserving our ways, but helping others understand their own choices better." The transformation of the community had been subtle but profound. Rather than being changed by their encounter with the modern world, they had found ways to engage with it that strengthened their principles. The young people's technology use remained limited and purposeful, focused entirely on their teaching mission. Community life continued its traditional rhythms, but now with a clearer understanding of why each practice mattered. Hannah joined them, carrying a basket of fresh bread for the visitors. "The English reporter who first came here, the one Sarah invited to dinner. She returns each week now, not to write stories, but to learn. Yesterday she told me she's simplified her own life after understanding our principles." This was perhaps the most significant outcome of their crisis. Instead of becoming a curiosity or a controversy, the community had emerged as teachers of desperately needed wisdom about conscious living, community building, and purposeful choice. The documentation project had evolved into something unique, not a documentary or a reality show, but what Joseph called a wisdom archive. Short, focused demonstrations of their practices, each accompanied by explanations of the principles behind them. Universities were using them in courses on sustainable living and community development. Religious groups studied them for insights into maintaining tradition in modern times. Environmental organizations learned from their low-impact lifestyle choices. But more importantly, the project had given the young people a way to engage with modern tools while strengthening their connection to tradition. They understood now that their role wasn't to preserve the past, but to demonstrate its relevance to the future. As the morning wore on, more visitors arrived, a scheduled group this time, professionals seeking to understand the community's approach to education. Morgan watched as Jacob and Sarah prepared to demonstrate their teaching methods. "We don't just teach subjects," Sarah explained to the group. "We teach how knowledge serves community. Every lesson includes its practical application and its effect on others." The visitors, educators from various institutions, took notes as the young people demonstrated their approach. Here was another unexpected outcome. The crisis had led to opportunities for the community to influence modern education with their wisdom about integrated learning. Joseph, who had been quietly observing, added his perspective. "In your schools, you teach children to ask, 'What can I achieve?' We teach them to ask, 'How can I contribute?'" The morning's demonstrations continued, each one revealing another layer of wisdom embedded in their daily practices. The visitors learned about their approach to conflict resolution, their methods of collective decision-making, their ways of supporting community members through difficulties. Dr. Peterson arrived for Joseph's checkup, bringing news from the hospital. The board had approved a new program incorporating insights from Amish healing practices into their patient care. Your wisdom about the connection between community support and healing has transformed how we think about recovery, he reported. As noon approached, Hannah called everyone to dinner, visitors included. The meal demonstrated another aspect of their wisdom, the importance of sharing food as a way of building understanding. Conversations flowed naturally, questions were asked and answered, connections were made. Morgan, sitting between Joseph and a visiting professor of environmental studies, observed how the crisis had led to something no one had anticipated, a way for ancient wisdom to speak directly to modern challenges. Your community has become a kind of living laboratory, the professor was saying, not for testing new technologies but for understanding timeless principles about sustainable living. Joseph's response captured the essence of their transformation. We do not seek to be an example, he said quietly. We seek to live truthfully. If others find wisdom in our ways, that is God's work, not ours. After the meal, as the visitors departed and the community returned to their afternoon tasks, Morgan found himself in a final conversation with Joseph in the garden. The elder was stronger now, able to tend his beloved plants again. When thee first arrived here, Joseph said, carefully pruning a tomato plant, thee was lost in more ways than one. Now thee has found a different kind of purpose. Morgan nodded, understanding the truth in these words. His time here had changed him in ways no film role ever had. I came here by accident, he replied, but I stayed by choice. And now? Joseph asked. What will thee do with what thee has learned? Morgan had been thinking about this. His agent's calls had become less frequent as it became clear that something fundamental had shifted in his priorities. I think, he said slowly, there are other stories that need telling. Not just about your community, but about wisdom wherever it's found. Joseph smiled, pleased but not surprised. Then thee has learned our most important lesson. Wisdom isn't just about knowing truth. It's about living it and sharing it in ways that help others find their own path. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden, Morgan reflected on how far they had all come from that crisis a month ago. The community had found a way to share its wisdom without compromising its values. The young people had discovered how to use modern tools in service of tradition, and he had found a new purpose that transcended his Hollywood career. Sarah appeared, at the garden gate, tablet in hand. We've finished today's teaching module, she reported. Would thee like to see it before we share it? Joseph gestured for her to join them. The three sat together on the garden bench, watching as images of their daily life played across the screen. But now these images carried deeper meaning, each one carefully chosen to demonstrate principles that the modern world desperately needed to remember. Thee has become a good teacher, Joseph told his granddaughter, not just of our ways, but of why they matter. Sarah's smile showed how much this praise meant to her. I understand now, she said. We're not just keeping tradition alive, we're helping it speak to new generations. As the day drew to a close, Morgan prepared to leave for his hotel. His role had evolved too, from accidental visitor to student to bridge between worlds. He would return tomorrow and many days after, not as an observer but as a participant in this ongoing story of wisdom, finding new ways to speak to a changing world. The crisis that had threatened to expose and exploit their way of life had instead revealed its deeper relevance. In choosing to respond with wisdom rather than fear, the community had discovered its larger purpose, not just preserving tradition, but demonstrating how timeless principles could guide modern lives. Joseph's final words of the day captured this transformation perfectly. Sometimes what seems like an ending is really a beginning. The world came to learn about us, but perhaps we were meant to learn how to teach. As Morgan drove away, he could see Sarah and Jacob setting up to film the evening milking, not as entertainment, but as another lesson in purposeful living. The sun was setting over Lancaster County, painting the sky in shades of promise as one chapter ended and another began. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.